So one of the biggest myths that they tell us is that things are constantly the same. We've heard that a lot. Things never change. There's this permanent human nature. People only act a certain way. And the fact that we're out here to protest about tuition hikes is actually some of the biggest proof that that's not true. My grandparents went to college for free. They went to college on the GI Bill. I think most of our grandparents did. If you fought in the Second World War, you got to go to college for free. My father, he went to college and he worked in a factory during the summer while he was in college, and he was able to pay for not only his tuition but also his room and board for the year based on just working 3 months in the summer in a bookbindery, right? Now, this new phenomenon of people being in debt of hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes just for trying to get an education, that's a very new thing. It's a new development. And it shows things are changing constantly throughout society. It also, one big new phenomenon is home foreclosures. All across the United States, homes are being foreclosed. There's whole neighborhoods in Detroit. It actually started with, racist predatory lending. They went after African-American people, the African-American middle class, but it soon expanded to everyone, and now there's homes everywhere that have been foreclosed and shut down. And right now also we're seeing an expanding amount of police terror and brutality. They've got 2 million people in prison. On top of that, you've got stop and frisk. If you're most major cities, the police can stop you and pat you down at any point. It's an illegal search, but it goes on. And they got the surveillance drones flying above. And one of the struggles I was involved in Cleveland, just after I got involved in Workers' World Party, which I'm a member of, was my involvement with the case of Rebecca Whitby. Rebecca Whitby was a young woman. She was 20 years old, and she had had a little too much to drink one night. And her father, who was a veteran and a former alcoholic, he didn't want her to get in her car and drive because she was under the influence. So he made what he said was actually the biggest mistake in his entire life, and he called the police. And the police showed up. By the time the police had gotten there, Rebecca had agreed not to get into her car. But the police barged in anyway, and they went upstairs to where Rebecca was, and they slammed her head into the ground, and they then ripped off her shirt and her bra and began choking her with it. And then her mother threw herself over her daughter's body, and at that point the police, they pulled out their batons and started beating on the mother. And they were both dragged to jail, and their neighbor who lived across the street, an older white woman, ran out of the house when she saw the police cars outside, and she heard the cops, shoving them into the car and shouting, you black bitch, and all these racial slurs were being shouted at them. And so they were taken to jail, both Rebecca Whitby and her mother, who was also named Rebecca Whitby. And they were taken to jail, and they were released, actually, without charges. And no charges were filed until they filed a complaint against the police. And they filed a complaint because they said these police barged into our house, they choked and nearly killed my daughter, and it happened. So then the police charged the Whitby family. They charged them with, they charged the daughter with assault on a police officer and attempted theft of a police officer's firearm. They claimed that the daughter had tried to steal the cop's gun. And so the family went to court for 2 years. For 2 years they went to court to deal with this. And they were acquitted. Rebecca was acquitted on every charge. Except for resisting arrest, and she did a little time for resisting arrest. But for 2 years, the family was dragged into court for 2 years, and the father actually lost his job because he was a truck driver. And when he was having to go to court every 2 weeks with a hearing for 2 years before it finally gets to trial, he lost his job. The mother also lost her job because she was up for a promotion. And then when they did a background check, found out that she had pending felony charges. She lost her job as well. So they went through all of that for 2 years. And I remember we would be out in front of the Justice Center in Cleveland, which is the big center, where they're at. And we would have these, a picket line. We would chant, "The Whitbys are not guilty. You've got to set them free." We'd be out there for 2 years until finally a jury got to hear it, and they were acquitted. There's no fingerprints on this gun she allegedly took. It was all nonsense. So we see the growing police thing. And the thing is, there's cases like this in every major city. New York City gets a lot of publicity because it's this kind of center. You hear about Ramarley Graham, was an African-American youth, was walking home. The cops wanted to stop and frisk him, and he had a joint of marijuana in his pocket, and he didn't want to be stopped and frisked, so he ran away from them. The cops then burst into his apartment, followed him home, burst into his apartment, and then put a bullet through his heart in the middle of the apartment in front of his grandmother and his younger brother. You hear about Sean Bell, who was just driving home on his wedding day, and 2 plainclothes cops, put 41 bullets into his car and killed him. But then also in Baltimore it's happening. In Baltimore, people in Workers' World Party are organizing a march from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. against police terror and for jobs, because in Baltimore it's the same thing. The police are killing people and they're getting away with it. And that's also part of the economic changes that are going on. And I tell people about, when I'm a communist, being a communist isn't just a political belief. If you go to Cuba, you go to, North Korea, you went to the old Soviet Union, if someone said I'm a communist, it didn't mean I think a certain thing. It meant I do a certain thing. It means I live a certain lifestyle, When you're a communist, your life is about the struggle. You're constantly involved in struggling with the working class and the oppressed against the ruling class and against the bankers, and your life is about this confrontation. And the heyday of communism in the United States was in the 1930s. In 1932, the Communist Party had its national convention in New York City, and it was in Madison Square Gardens. Madison Square Gardens is where they had their national convention. It was packed full of people, and I always love to quote, Langston Hughes actually wrote a poem for the convention, and part of the poem is he said, "Put one more S in the USA and make it Soviet. Put one more S in the USA.
Next week.
Oh, we can win it yet. When the land belongs to the farmers and the factories to working men. The USA, when we take control, will be the USSA then."
Oh, the Morning Revolution.
Yeah, and that was, at that point in the U.S. there were home foreclosures, and the Communist Party built these groupings called unemployment councils. And so when they would go to foreclose the home in someone's neighborhood, the communists would get together and they would bust the lock the sheriff put on the door, and they'd burst the doors open and they'd put the family's furniture right back in the home. And I mean, they didn't just have this in New York City or in Chicago. It was all throughout the country. They had the unemployment councils that were fighting on behalf of the working class. They had huge hunger marches, that they were called, where tens of thousands of unemployed workers would go to Washington, D.C., and they would burst into the Capitol building, and they would be chanting, "Worker wages now! Worker wages now!" And they would track down, follow their members of Congress and say, why are you giving money to the banks, and why aren't you giving us jobs and health care? It was a whole confrontation, and actually March 6th, 1931, was International Unemployment Day. And why was it international? It was because at that point there was something called the Communist International. All the communists in the world were united into this organization called the Comintern, or the Communist International. It was being directed by the Soviet Union. And at that point, there was a Great Depression throughout the entire Western world. In the U.S., people weren't just living in tents to protest tuition hikes. People were literally living in tents. Now, I know in Nevada that's happening now. Outside of Las Vegas, there's actually a tent city where hundreds of workers are actually living in tents. People have had their homes foreclosed. But at that point, there were these things called Hoovervilles all over the country. And Unemployment Day, while the capitalist world was having a Great Depression, the Soviet Union was actually having a boom. And it's one thing that it's so well hidden, but it's so obvious if you look at it then. The Soviet Union, in 1917, the workers, the peasants, they rose up and they overthrew the Tsar. And in the process of overthrowing the Tsar, they built these organizations called Soviets. What is a Soviet? It's a workers' council, or Lenin called it a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies. And they built these things called Soviets. And eventually, Lenin, and the Bolshevik Party pushed for a new government, a new kind of state, a workers' council. Right, and the Soviets became the basis for a new kind of government in the Soviet Union, and the banks and the factories and the industries and the commanding heights of the economy were actually held in common. You didn't have a small group of people called capitalists like we have in this country who own the economy. You had a collectively run economy. And because of that, because they had a planned economy, because the things weren't being run according to profits, they achieved these real miracles. For example, the largest hydroelectric power plant in the world was in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they went from being a country with barely any plumbing. The only parts of the country that had electricity were certain areas in the cities. Soon the whole country was lit up with electricity. You had plumbing, in the houses. You had these villages that were just kind of agrarian villages where people were barely surviving, turning into huge industrial centers. The life expectancy of the Soviet people eventually doubled. People were living at the time of the revolution around 30 or 40 years old. They were living to be 70 and 80 as a result of what socialism did. In the Soviet Union, not a single person was unemployed. In a capitalist economy, we have all these people who are unemployed, because they need to keep the wages down. It's competition for jobs keeps the wages down. But in a socialist economy, you want to include everyone in the economy. Every bit of labor is utilized to help build in collective wealth. And the Soviet Union, they built the largest hydroelectric power plant in the world. And then the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and they defeated the Nazis. And soon they actually ended up launching Sputnik, the first spacecraft, and the first people into space was created by socialism. Huge things were achieved because of socialism. And one of the greatest contributions of the Soviet Union was that they aided the black liberation struggle in the United States. In the United States, Jim Crow segregation and racism was the ugly aspect of this society. This society was built on the slave labor of African Americans. But the Soviet Union made clear that they opposed that. And actually, there was a group of young men called the Scottsboro Nine. There were 9 young African American men who'd been on a train, and they'd been accused of raping a white prostitute. And they were on this train, and the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, came to their defense. And the mother of one of the Scottsboro Nine went to the Soviet Union and went around speaking, and they had huge marches against racism and segregation in Moscow, where workers from the Soviet Union, from a country nowhere near the United States, were holding up signs saying "Down with the Ku Klux Klan" and "Down with racism," and that was happening in a socialist country. I mean, great things were achieved. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union isn't there anymore. Now, Cuba is still in existence. Cuba is still a stronghold of socialism, and even the CIA World Fact Book talks about how Cubans live on average longer than any other people in Latin America, and they're holding out. And you go to Cuba, it's the same thing. No unemployment. It's a poor country, but compared to other countries in Latin America, the Cubans are much better off because they have a socialist system, because there's no ruling class. So all over this country, there are confrontations going on with the bankers and the capitalists, right? We're here talking about tuition hikes. Who is it who wants to keep tuition high so people have to borrow from the banks? It's not the students who want tuition to be high. It's not the government. They just want us to really learn the value of a dollar. It's the banks. The banks run the policy in the United States. Who is it who's building these prisons? They have prisons for profit. Who's doing that? It's the capitalist government of the United States. The bankers and the corporations are making money from locking people away. There's class struggle around the corner in every sector there. You can find the class struggle, the confrontation between the working class and those who without. And ultimately, now back in the 30s when people were organizing, and I talk about this upsurge of communism in the United States, they were very inspired by what was going on in the Soviet Union. But there was a book that they read, and it wasn't really about the wonders of socialism in the Soviet Union, but it was called Towards Soviet America. It was by William Z. Foster, the leader of the U.S. Communist Party. And in it, he had a vision for what communism would look like in the United States. He laid out a vision of the United Soviet States of America, the USSA. This vision of what it could be like if we had a country where we didn't have Wall Street and the bankers having power. What could that be like? And he talked about abolishing unemployment. He talked about all the unemployed people that were living in tents, bursting and seizing those hotels in Manhattan and other places and housing the unemployed. He talked about how in the U.S. and the Soviet Union they'd had to industrialize. They had to build up the industry, but the U.S. already had this industry. It just wasn't under workers' control, and if they could put it under workers' control, real miracles could go on. He talked about a revolution in education, having education that empowered the workers to actually be the rulers of society, not teaching people how to follow orders and obey blindly. He talked about all of that, and we really need to start thinking about what a socialist United States would be like. We all need to have that, because if you look at all the struggles that have ever gone on, whether it's the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-racist struggles, the labor movement, all the best fighters have always been communists. They've always been communists because communists know what it's about. They know that we can get beyond this system. If you see it as just simply a struggle within making the capitalist system better, pretty soon you're going to give up. You're going to lose steam because it's depressing. You can only go to so many meetings. You can only have so many capitalist elections where you vote for one candidate thinking that they're better and you get the same thing. You can only do that so many times. But if you have a vision, an understanding that there's the possibility of getting beyond this system, of actually having a socialist society, you can actually achieve the wondrous things, and you can even do things short of revolution that are miraculous. The civil rights movement was largely led by communists. The anti-Vietnam War movement was largely led by communists. And if we want to actually stop this attack on working people, whether it's the tuition hikes, whether it's the busting of unions, we need to start thinking about socialism and Marxism-Leninism. And that Marxism-Leninism is a science. It's a methodology used in the struggle against capitalism, right? Leninism, it's not like a religion. You get that idea. You see pictures of Marx and Lenin and you think, oh, this is a religious idea. The holy work of Marx says this. But no, these are strategies that have been utilized in the struggle. Right? They're things we've learned in the process of doing the same thing we're doing now. The Bolsheviks were involved in every strike. They were involved in every struggle. And they learned the methods of doing so. And that eventually led to them, the theory of the vanguard party, and eventually overthrowing and seizing power in Russia. The Chinese Revolution, there's a lot to learn from that. The Cuban Revolution, the Korean Revolution. All of these are struggles. We can all learn from all of that. And that's why I'm very excited. I'm so happy to have been here. And one thing I just want to comment on that I thought was one of the best things about this week is, we had these signs, and people have been getting a lot of flack for these signs, but people have been stopping to talk to us because people are looking for something different. When I was when I was in college, I was involved in a lot of activism, and a lot of young people, it was kind of the beginning of the rise of the Ron Paul libertarian stuff. And a lot of people would say, well, I don't want to be a communist because I want to be rich. And I would say to people, we're young people, we're young, we got our whole life ahead of us. It's important, it's okay to have dreams, it's okay to think about the future. But instead of just dreaming about myself and dreaming about, what's in it for me and, my own future, let's start to dream together as a generation. Let's start to think about the world we can construct collectively if we start to fight against the bosses and the super rich. Let's start to think about that. So, I'm inspired by Occupy Wall Street, I'm inspired by what I've seen today, I'm inspired by the labor movement, I'm really excited, and that's really what communists have to say. That's the communist take on the whole struggle going on. So I just want to engage and let's have a conversation about that.
I'd add that the only way to get rich is by exploiting somebody, by making somebody else poor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why are communists the best fighters for reform?
Because they understand how the system works. If you think that this is a democracy and that you can just change it by voting or writing a letter to your congressman, you're not going to be able to do that. Communists understand that it's a life and death struggle between the workers and the bosses, and that there's one thing you hear about unions. They talk about union thugs. You ever heard that? They talk about union thugs. Well, if you look back at the 30s, the communists, when they were acting like thugs, when they were shutting things down, when they were blocking streets, when unions were actually having a confrontational attitude and saying, no, we're not going to let you lower our wages, we're not going to let you destroy our jobs, that's when they actually won things.
You've got to put the fear in their hearts.
Right, yeah, and if you see it as the bosses are just like us and we're just going to sit down and negotiate with them, you're not going to win. Yep. You're not going to win. There's a slogan, when labor plays hardball, workers win. In 1934 alone, there were 3 general strikes in this country, in San Francisco, in Minneapolis, and in Toledo, Ohio. Yeah. And in every one of those cities, communists were leading workers in a confrontation with the bosses, shutting the city down, and at the same time they're doing it, talking about how that city would be different under workers' control, under workers' power. So it's very interesting. Any other questions?
I was thinking about what I'm saying.
Well, you're right. What
Could you
fascism?
summarize the
Well, he was talking about the government becoming fascist and things like that. That's what fascism is. Hitler came to power in Germany because the Communist Party was one of the biggest political parties at that time. And they were, I read a book called Unemployed Struggles. It was by a leader of the communist movement in Britain. And he went to Germany in 1928. This is before even the Great Depression, right? This is when there was a quote-unquote roaring 20s. And he went there, and in Germany, they would go to in the middle of the night, they would go to Berlin. And they would lead these demonstrations of unemployed workers in Berlin, and they would break open the store windows, and they would start redistributing all the bread in Berlin. And then when the police showed up, the communists, they had this group called the Red Front Fighters League, which was the armed wing of the Communist Party, would be on the roof with sniper rifles. And so the cops would come in to attack these people, and the communists would be on the roof sniping the cops down. That's how militant the communist movement was. And Hitler was a response to that. Hitler was fascism is always a response to the people rising up, because the bourgeoisie likes to pretend that we have free speech and we have democracy, but as soon as we start threatening their power, then we see the hammer come down. Then, Occupy Wall Street, they were out there and their park got raided, and they learned all about democracy, people getting arrested for speaking too loud and all kinds of things. Bourgeois democracy is a joke, but they like to have it. And in any society, as long as society is stable, right? As long as society is stable, you can say whatever you want, right? I mean, I can get up right now. We can have these flags. Why? Because no one's listening to us, right? If there was a real danger of this campus, being seized by the students and kicking them out, they wouldn't be letting us do this. They'd be in here with, there'd be cops here, there'd be clubs, there'd be mace, there'd be riot gear, because.
That's what I'm saying, though. I just signed one or something.
But yet, when the banks collapsed, and they needed to get government bailout money or TARP money for the banks, there was barely any paperwork. The form was like two-sided, right? When it's to serve them, we talk about the social programs. They always do everything they can to keep people from collecting collecting anything like that, or collecting even unemployment, which you pay for, right? You pay for out of your labor. It goes in. But when the banks need service, or look at how efficiently the army moves. When it's time to bomb and destroy some country somewhere that's standing up to the United States, all of a sudden the whole apparatus of everything works really efficiently, and they've got drones and bombs. They can do everything.
Yeah.
We're living in a class society, and the governments serve the rich, and in a socialist country, the governments will work on our behalf. That's the difference. But we don't want a government. We want to eventually get to the time where there's no coercion. Socialism is the first stage. That's where the banks, factories, industries are held in common, and we have a workers' government based in like community councils, like workers' councils and Soviets. But the higher stage is communism, and that's when there's been so much of an abundance, a material abundance created, that we won't even have to have a government to begin with.
Or
and
money.
That's or money or anything like that. People will be able to do what they want and take what they need. That's the higher stage, and that's the end goal. Socialism is the beginning, and it's very easy. I mean, it's so obvious that you need socialism at this point. I mean, when you see that there's how many empty houses for every homeless person?
20.
20 empty houses for every homeless person. If we had a planned economy, if we had the human mind in control of the economy and not the irrational profit motive, we could just put the homeless people in the houses. Duh. Right? Or all these unemployed people. No work is getting done. In this country, the bridges are falling apart. Water isn't being purified. In a socialist country, we go to the unemployed people and say, your job is to purify the water. It would be that easy. But it's not in capitalism, because the profit motive is destroying the world. The profit motive is essentially destroying the world, and now, where there's threats of new wars. We got the North Korean flag out here. We got an endless flag for this right now. Well, the U.S. wants a new war against North Korea. They want to have a war against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and it's really, really very frightening, because Obama flew nuclear weapons, B-52 planes, into South Korea. That's what provoked this whole confrontation. Obama flew B-52s there and basically threatened to nuke them. Yeah, and that's what it's getting down to. In Syria, the U.S. is sending these rebels in there that are destabilizing and tearing up the country. They just bombed and destroyed Libya, a country that had the highest life expectancy on the African continent before it was bombed and destroyed by NATO. That's what's happening, and we live in a global capitalist system, and it's time that we come together and have the common sense to overthrow it. Well,
Repeat the answer.
He asked if the U.S. seizes Syria, is that going to be the last thing? There's always going to be more wars, because this U.S. economy depends on war.
And that's why revolution is actually going to be an end to violence in many ways, even though it sounds violent. Is that the system needs war.
There'll always be more wars. The U.S. will never be able to do this. I mean, look at the people that the U.S. fought in Afghanistan and are now fighting in Afghanistan were once people the U.S. was supporting. In Afghanistan in '79, they had a socialist, and it wasn't a socialist revolution, but a democratic revolution, and brought down a U.S.-backed dictator. And they set up, what was called, it was the People's Democratic Party ran Afghanistan. It was teaching women to read. It had agricultural programs, and they were actually reforestation, a lot of environmental stuff, because the forests in Afghanistan have all been cut down by the imperialists to make lumber in Britain. And they were reforesting the country. They had the Democratic Youth Leagues that were going around and reforesting the country. And so, the U.S. started aligning, and Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi were these wealthy Saudi folks that the U.S. sent in to Afghanistan to destabilize. And so they formed the Mujahideen, and they were running around pouring acid on women's faces and tearing things up. And Reagan actually welcomed to the White House, gave them medals and honors, and said, these are freedom fighters that are fighting against the communists. It was the Soviet Union that sent its troops into Afghanistan at the request of the People's Democratic Party to protect it from the U.S.-backed thugs. And now, after the Soviet Union, Gorbachev eventually pulled the Soviet aid out of there, and eventually the U.S. was able to overturn the democratic government in Afghanistan, and the Taliban came in. But then the Taliban started standing up for Afghanistan against the U.S. And so then the U.S. is now fighting the Taliban. So the U.S. is never going to be at peace with the people of the world, mainly because people want freedom. People don't want to be exploited by anybody, whether it's in your home country or especially if it's in a far-off country. People don't want to be exploited, and so there will always be a continuing global class war against the U.S. imperialists and the bankers until imperialism is brought down. And that's why socialist countries have had such difficulty in the past. That's why in Cuba, the electricity in Cuba is only 6 hours a day. Why is that? Because there's a huge blockade around the country.
It's better now. But.
Yeah, there's a huge blockade around the country by the U.S. Until imperialism is eradicated, all the socialism we're going to see is really in a way going to be premature. To see real socialism, to see socialism the way, as a higher system than capitalism, it's going to require U.S. imperialism to be brought down before we can really see the beauty of what socialism is meant to be. Not that things haven't been achieved. because what was done in the Soviet Union, what's been done in Cuba, these are amazing achievements, but there's still not anything near what's going to be achieved when socialism as a higher stage than capitalism becomes the dominant world system. It's so outrageous. When I was in college, you could be a Marxist in college. It's sociology. You can read Marx, you can talk about it. But the one thing you cannot do is start talking about, socialist countries and saying anything positive. The second you start saying that things are good in Cuba, oh my God, there's hell to pay. The second you start saying that everything wasn't hell and misery in the Soviet Union, oh my God. But if you look at even the anti-communist propaganda in the 50s, actually didn't say that socialism was hell and misery, and it was so efficient it was going to take over, right? It was the Red Menace. Like that was what the anti-communist propaganda was, and that's a number of the inconsistencies. For example, in the 20s, there was this propaganda that the communists were behind homosexuality, right? And that the communists were going to make everyone be gay and destroy the family. But now you hear the communists are all homophobes and they hate gay people. It's really inconsistent. Anti-communist propaganda is very inconsistent. But one of the things you hear about Stalin and Mao is this talk of like man-made famines, right? Yeah. They say, that man-made famines. Well, every day was a famine before the Russian Revolution. People were dying annually of starvation. And in China, people were dying annually all the time. And it was those revolutions that actually enabled starvation to be cured in those countries. And in the Ukraine, they rapidly transitioned, probably too quickly, from a private agricultural system to a national, a collective farm system, and they did it very rapidly, and there was almost semi-civil war. A lot of the rich peasants, were burning their crops rather than have them be socialized. And it was a chaotic situation. But once that situation was over, once that was over, the food system that actually came out of the collectivization was much more efficient than anything that had ever existed in the entire history of that country. And the life expectancy of Soviet people was like, was nearly doubled. So, the whole thing is just a very false premise. And there are famines, in Africa, in the neoliberal governments of Africa, where they just let the U.S. banks come in there and extract. There's famines there all the time, and no one says, oh, capitalism's committing a genocide. Yeah. India, there was all kinds of man-made famines. Ireland, there were man-made famines, even in the 1800s. So all over the capitalist world, there are man-made, purposeful famines, right? And I'll tell you, 30,000 children die every day of some kind of starvation-related disease. But we live in a world where there's enough food to feed the entire human race 3 times over. It's the profit system that is committing a man-made famine every day. And its socialism has created great achievements in the process of trying to get rid of the capitalist system. And sure, errors have been made, bad things have been done. I'm not going to deny that. But the fact that they would even use that against socialism is really it's vulgar, and it just shows, the vulgarity of their whole argument. Yeah.
This and that.
Well, that's what I was taught in school, is that what the communists want is they want a garbage man to get the exact same wages, and that's really not what we advocate. We advocate common ownership of the banks, factories, and industries, and eventually leading to a time when we don't need a state and we can kind of have, and that's kind of a non sequitur. But as far as China and one of the big factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union was the fact that Gorbachev and others, Khrushchev before that, were actually implementing mixed economy policies. They were having capitalism, essentially. They were allowing capitalist sectors of the market, and that eventually created the basis for a counter-revolution. The Soviet Union didn't collapse at the time when it had the command economy during the 5-year plans, when it was the efficient socialist system. It collapsed later when they were messing around with capitalism, and it collapsed also when the party stopped really preaching, a Marxist message. It started preaching this kind of, like Gorbachev was talking about universal human values. He was talking about the ideals of the French Revolution. And it was when they moved away from kind of the Marxist ideas, and when they started implementing kind of reformist ideas, that's when the collapse happened. I agree with how you're characterizing things. There's a lot in what you said there, but yeah, I do agree that the market reforms in China are very dangerous and it's causing a lot of problems. I'll agree with that.
And a big reason why socialism here would be different is the only reason why someone like the Chinese even have to contemplate adopting capitalistic elements in their economy is they had to have a revolution because they were such a poor country to begin with. If we had all the wealth that was expropriated from the rest of the world that lies in places like Manhattan and the rest of the U.S. today, we could start building socialism without having any of these market things at all.
Small term skills, what can you start to do? You know, like just right now, you know, we're talking about, you know.
Well, the big thing we need to start doing is we need to start forming working class organizations. Like, you know, one initiative is like the People's Power Assembly that's going on in New York to try and bring labor unions and Occupy Wall Street and anti-police brutality, anti-racist activists into the same room and start building up something kind of like what the Soviets were in the USSR. And that's the big thing. We need to start building organizations that can represent the entire working class and fight on their behalf and represent different struggles going on that can eventually lay the basis for the wider confrontation and the struggle for power. And that's the big thing that we need to talk about. You know, is building up power. You know, the biggest myth you've ever heard is that we get to wait.